There we go. Thank you all for being here. It's kind of like Throwback Thursday, I guess, that we're going back to Zoom meetings again. But given the schedule, Richie, I think this was the best way to make this work. So,
Oh yeah, it's hard to get you and me in the same place at the same time, we've discovered.
yes, I actually, that was one of the best things that happened in the 10 or 15 minutes that we started this beforehand. We figured out a date to go down to the SLH together. That was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was. I was like, wait, I've got this date a couple of weeks out where I actually have nothing, which is very, very rare. And it was even more rare that you had nothing. And I felt like it's an enigma. I'll put it that way.
Yes, it is an enigma, and it's a sign even that we should do this, that we need to make this happen. So it's perfect. Everybody, I got the chat function open here, the chat room. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free, ask any questions. I will forward them on and we can go from there. But Richie, thanks for having us here. It's been so much fun working with you for the last couple of years now and kind of keeping it quiet for a while.
Yeah, well, it's we had to keep it quiet because we didn't want the whole world to know until it was ready. But I think you should tell people what our little chat group on Messenger is called. So, because the first rule of
the first rule of Fight Club is what we called our chat group, because nobody can speak of Fight Club. So we did that, and that was kind of our group, and where we hid our Pinot conversations for a while. I'd like everybody to kind of get to know you a bit first before we get into like real Pinot details. So obviously you don't sound like you're from Texas. You don't say y'all a lot. You don't sound like I do in some ways. And you were born where?
So I was born in Sydney, Australia. Sort of grew up mostly in Melbourne, which is a southeastern city. It's actually, as of last week after the Australian census, it's actually Australia's largest city. They just surpassed Sydney. And if you know about the rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, that's bragging rights for Melbourne, because it's kind of like Northern California, Southern California rivalry. They like to beat each other up. Yeah, grew up in Melbourne, went to high school there, did my first degree in molecular biology in Melbourne, then took a year off university. And
so what was the plan with the molecular biology? What were you going to do?
I was involved in a research group that worked on a copper disease called Menkes disease.
Okay.
And that was the lab I was in. And me and my now wife were in that lab, and both did really well, and could have gone on and done my PhD. My wife actually went on and started hers. But I decided, after taking a year off university when I was 19 and traveling to America and tasting wine, maybe not quite legally old enough to taste wine in the US, but I could drink in Australia, so I feel what's the difference. And that was the first time I had wine side by side in my life. So 2 different red wines, or 3 different red wines. And that was sort of the moment I decided I wanted to be a winemaker. So instead of going on with molecular biology, I moved to Adelaide and did a degree in winemaking at the University of Adelaide, and worked for a few years in Australia and New Zealand as a winemaker, and wanted to come back to California.
Got a great and long wine history. Did you, I mean, growing up, was wine part of the family?
Yeah, it's actually funny. Like the earliest memories of wine for me was when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and there's a place in northeastern Victoria called Lake Hume, which actually sits on the state border, and it's very close to a wine region called Rutherglen. And my earliest memories, probably 7 or 8, 8 actually, going up to Lake Hume for a family vacation, and my parents going wine tasting in Rutherglen. So you have to remember, this is the 80s. Mm-hmm. So drink driving laws are not as strict in Australia as they are now. And so my parents go wine tasting, and I'm one of 3 boys, and we all sat in the back of the car and hated it. And my parents would go to cellar door, and me and my brothers would literally beat the shit out of each other in the car and fight. And my parents would drink more to try and appease the pain of 3 boys fighting constantly. And yeah, and I distinctly remember it because there was a box for a very famous winery called Campbell's, and they make a Shiraz called Bobby Burns Shiraz. It's an old vine Shiraz, and to this day, my dad still has that box, because he has it's up in one of the closets in their house in Melbourne, and it has like a bunch of old paperwork in it. And every time I'm home, that's the closet is in the spare room at my parents' house, and I see that box, and it reminds me of that vacation where me and my brothers literally beat the shit out of each other.
Yeah. So great memories with wine right there. You getting beaten up or beating up your brothers, one of the three.
Yeah.
Who won those fights usually?
Definitely not me, because I was the smallest. Even though I was the middle child, I was the smallest. So yeah, I didn't win many what we call biffos very often.
So wine then, though, coming to the States took it to a different level, kind of a more serious level for
Yeah,
you?
so yeah, I graduated, I started my first job in the wine industry was with Penfolds when I was a student. They have their original winery in the suburbs, literally of Adelaide, and they have about 10 and a half acres of old vine Shiraz there. And I worked there for a couple of years doing everything from working in what's called the cellar door, which is the taste room on weekends, to work in the winery, to all sorts of things within the Penfolds group. Probably the highlight being recorking clinics, which is Penfolds, like one of the only wineries in the world that do that. And then graduated, went to the Yarra Valley, worked for a small producer called Oak Ridge, which is famous for Chardonnay. Very different style of Chardonnay to what I make now at Rombauer. And then was sort of ducking around doing bits and pieces of winemaking work, and thought I need to go back to California and do a harvest. So I went through a visa exchange company for graduate winemakers and submitted my resume, and I got a job offer from Rombauer without even knowing what it was. I had no job interview, nothing. I didn't know what Rombauer was at that stage. Being from another country, all I knew about the Napa Valley, honestly, was Mondavi, Beringer, and Opus One. I'm not going to lie.
Sure.
I just sort of heard about Screaming Eagle, but this is the early 2000s, and I thought, well, you need to have Napa Valley or somewhere in California on your resume. And I thought, well, how bad can it be? It's going to be 12 weeks. And this year will be my 20th harvest at Rombauer.
So tell me about that intern class, that group. I mean, I always think interns are fascinating when you bring them in wineries. I mean, there are people who are really serious about this, that you can tell they're going to go on and have a career. There are people that are just trying to avoid real life for a while, and they do.
So true.
They do one southern hemisphere harvest and then one northern hemisphere, and they go. It's like the eternal student kind of thing.
Yeah.
And people are just playing. I mean, what was that group of interns like? Was it fun?
So there was 5 of us that year. There was Freddie, who was a Lebanese kid who grew up in Australia, who was literally how you describe it, basically trying to avoid life. He had done one vintage before that in a winery that did 20 tons. So really had no winery experience, but was to this day one of the biggest characters I've ever met. And could tell you many, many funny stories about drinking with Fred all over the world. Then there was Ricardo, who's from Portugal, from the Jura Valley, from a very wealthy family. And I'll never forget him because he asked me, I was making some bolognese pasta one night. And he's like, how do you make the pasta? I thought he meant the sauce. And so I was explaining how I make my bolognese sauce. He's like, no, the pasta. This is a kid who didn't know how to cook for himself, like literally cook dry pasta.
Okay.
And he wanted to know how to boil water. I shit you not. It was the funniest. It was so bizarre.
I was thinking he was actually asking about you making the pasta, not dry.
No,
like rolling it out. He's
like it was probably about 3 weeks in, I realized that his clothes were getting dirtier and dirtier. And I realized he was too embarrassed after we all gave him shit about cooking pasta that he didn't know how to use the washing machine. And so we had to teach him how to wash his clothes. So he was a great kid, but yeah, very, very smart, but clearly had never done anything for himself. And then there were 2 South Africans, Hanu and Chris. And I distinctly remember them because all these 2 wanted to do was drink brandy and Coke and party. And they would come home at all hours of the night, make an absolute mess of the house. And it was an intern house that Rombauer has on the property. And so we all lived together in this share house. We had our own rooms, but they would just trash the place. And I remember at one stage, they decided they didn't want to wash the dishes. And so they didn't go moldy. They put the dirty dishes in the fridge.
Oh my
and so I put those dirty dishes in their bed. And that started quite the tension in the household, because it ended in a bit of a push and shove. I'll put it that way. We never came to fist fight, but
wow,
I was definitely the more driven of all the interns. I'll put it that way.
I've always said that you could make a whole show like the Real World, the old MTV show, by just doing like A house.
Intern housing.
Yeah, intern housing kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember as well. So my wife, who I met in Australia, we weren't dating at that stage. We were best friends for many, many years. But I remember coming here, and back then they would give you a list that was like 15 pages long of all the interns in California. And we had this awesome house that was, you know, massive living room, across the road from the winery. It was free. I think we paid $50 a month rent, each of us or something, that the Rombauers owned. And Colonel Rombauer would come down and bring us wine all the time. And so it sort of got this reputation as a party house.
Sure.
And so I remember going through this list and just literally looking up every single girl on the list, every female name that I recognized, and calling them, because we had a phone in the house. This is before everyone had cell phones, and inviting them to a harvest party. And it was interesting because many years later, the winemaker for Artesa, Anna, she's from Portugal, and I bumped into her in New York, and this is probably like 2013, so almost 10 years later. And she's like, "Oh, you're at Rombauer." "Oh, when I first came to California, I went to some amazing parties at their intern house." I go, "Oh, what year was that?" And she's like, 2004. I'm like, those were my parties. I organized those, but had never actually met him.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's fun.
So it was amazing, actually.
All right. So who was the head winemaker at Rombauer then, and why did they decide to keep you on? I mean, I don't mean that in a rude way, but
Yeah. So there was Greg Ray was the head winemaker, and Rob Lloyd was the assistant winemaker. And I worked really, really hard. It was a really, really hot compressed vintage.
Mhm.
And Rob would just throw extra work at me, like weekend work. And then because I had a lot of lab experience after harvest, I did a lot of work in the lab for Rombauer because I only had one permanent lab person. And I just had a lot of different skills which no one else had between cellar and lab and winemaking. So I actually ended up leaving at the end of that harvest because I had a job lined up for Pernod Ricard in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. And I think I left here, probably December, and arrived in New Zealand mid-January. And by February, Greg was calling me saying, you need to come back for harvest at least. And so I finished that job in New Zealand, basically gave my notice before I'd even started it, did harvest for them. And then by like June was back on a plane back to Rombauer.
It's always hard because we always had interns that are really good, and you would love to find a way to keep them on, but
yeah,
you really can't do it. But your ability to do lab work, to me, that's one of the things that sometimes would cause us to keep somebody on longer.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting because Rombauer had this what's called a ChemStat, which is a machine for running enzymatic analysis. So a lot of it is like micropipetting. Mm-hmm. If you've ever worked in a genetics lab, 99% of what you do is micropipetting and plating. And so I just found the little errors in their lab in terms of the calibration of their micropipettes and how they were running their analysis, and just streamlined it. And I was so proficient, I could go really fast, right? So I could do twice as much analysis as their standard lab person was doing. So yeah, I just chugged on, and yeah,
what was the progress beyond? Okay, so then, I mean, you're then part of the team. How did you move up then to, like, do you go to cellar master or assistant winemaker?
No, so I stayed on through that harvest, and then actually left again. And had a job lined up in Australia in McLaren Vale as a harvest winemaker, and never actually started that job. And Rombauer said, we'll pay for your visa if you'll just stay on, and we'll put you in the lab, and you can become. I didn't have a title back then, but they'll pay me well. And I was like, well, I'm in the winemaking office with the winemaking team. I'm in the lab with the enologist. And then later that next year, the enologist actually left. And so I applied for that job. Mm-hmm. And stayed for 2 more years, and then quit again and took a job back in New Zealand in Marlborough, and sort of left in mid-December. Started that job mid-January in New Zealand, and by March, which was the peak of harvest, actually Colonel Rombauer was calling me saying, hey, you need to come back. Like, you just have to come back. And I didn't actually even ask. I remember it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and my wife and me were dating at that stage, and she'd moved to New Zealand with me. and she didn't like where we're living in New Zealand. And it's a beautiful place, but it's very rural.
Yeah.
And the share house we're in, and she was having trouble finding a job. And she'd been to Napa and visited me the year before. And she's like, no, let's just go back to Napa. I was like, what, whatever, go back for a year or two. And yeah, I got back there, and they gave me the assistant winemaker job. And then about 4 months after that, promoted me to winemaker. And then like 2 months after that, Greg retired, which I didn't know was going to happen.
Wow.
And yeah, and then all of a sudden I was in charge, and it was a bit scary.
Is there any pressure taking on a job? I mean, a style, the winery was already established. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the winery was definitely established, and we had a style, and we were growing very quickly, but we just couldn't make enough wine to meet demand. And so we were buying vineyards and looking at property, and I'd done a lot of vineyard work in Australia in between different things. And it was just very, like, I was 28 at the time when I took over at Rombauer, which is way, way too young. I only had, I don't know, 7 vintages under my belt.
And you'd quit them twice already, or 3 times.
Yeah, and I quit them twice. I mean, I must have, I guess I made a good impression with the Rombauer family and Greg, I don't know. But I distinctly remember coming out of, Rombauer back then was very, very much family run. Now the family just sits on the board. But back then, KR Rombauer was running sales. Shauna Rombauer had an office above the winemaking office. Colonel would come down to the office every day. And I just remember like the meeting up at Kerner's house, which is above the winery, at the family dinner table, where he said, Richie, we want you to take over the winemaking, hire the team you want. We'll support you to do it. We won't let you mess up. Like, you tell us what you need and we'll help you do it. And just thinking, oh my God, these people are insane. They have no idea. Like, they're running a multi-million-dollar business and they want a kid to make the wine. And I was pretty self-aware. I knew what my limitations were. But I remember walking out of there and walking down the house, down the driveway back to the winery from Kerner's house, calling my wife and actually crying because I was freaking out, because it was too much. And Shauna Rombauer was a very big, her office was right above mine. She could hear every conversation I had, and she really, really supported me and helped me. And yeah, I remember Luke, who was an Australian intern, who you, Adam, know very well now, started in 2005. We lived together for the 2006 vintage. In 2007, he went back traveling the world with his then girlfriend, who was from Santa Rosa, who's now his wife. And I knew Luke was coming back to California to get married. And I remember calling Luke and saying, dude, you got to come help me. I was like, going over my head. And we'd studied winemaking at the same university. He was a year behind me. And Luke came back, worked the 2008 harvest with me. And 2009 harvest, I made him an assistant winemaker, and we've been together ever since.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I hear stories all the time about famed drink parties and stuff that y'all, because he lives not far from you, so y'all.
He's like 2 blocks that way. His wife and my wife are best friends. Our kids are the same age. They go to the same school. And Luke, if the way I describe it, if you have me on one side, who's very highly strung at work and trying to go much faster than I need to go, and you have Luke on the other side, who's like very calm and very relaxed. Nothing ever phases him. If everything went to shit in the winery, Luke would be like there, picking up the pieces, going, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out. It's okay." Like, he's very good technically at winemaking, has a very good palate, but when I think of winemakers, I think of very highly strung, screamy, yelly, super arrogant people, and Luke's the exact opposite. He would rather sit at a table with 15 people and buy everyone a beer and just have fun.
Yeah, Luke's a great guy. I mean,
he's very calm.
Yeah. So, and during this time, as Rombauer is growing and growing rapidly, I mean, I assume some of the challenges are finding grapes and then finding places to put the grapes, and then yeah,
it's been never ending. So, I've become very, I'm very technical on what I do. I like to know the outcome before it happens if I can, which doesn't ever seem to work very well with wine. But so, calculating out, understanding before we plant a vineyard what the quality I think is going to be in terms of soil, rootstock, clone, climate, and honestly, my days at Penfolds, I would say, sort of set me up for Rombauer, because Penfolds makes very much a strong house style of wines. If you think of Penfolds Grange or OWT or St. Henri, they're three top Shirazes. They're very, very expensive wines, but they're all very stylistically different, but they still have the Penfolds house style. So you know it's a Penfolds wine, even though they're very unique and different. And Rombauer is much the same. We have our house style of how we do each particular variety, and then we have little things within that. But then Penfolds tends to focus, because it's quite a large global company, on very regionally specific varieties. So, you know, Shiraz they only grow in certain areas. Chardonnay they only get from certain areas. You know, they do make Pinot, or Peter Gago does, and it's very focused on certain regions. So they're very regionally specific for what region they think is the best for a certain varietal. And then within that region, you know, obviously looking at the soil and the rootstock and the clone for that climate. And Rombauer, over the last 20 years, I've tried to set it up in a very, very similar way. So, you know, we do Cabernet specifically from the Napa Valley. We do Chardonnay specifically from Canaris. We do Zinfandel almost exclusively from the Sierra Foothills. We do Pinot exclusively from Santa Lucia. And our Sauvignon Blanc, while it started as a Napa Valley wine, it's very quickly becoming a Sonoma wine, because we feel that's a better region climatically and soil-wise for the variety. So it's that earlier experience has really served me well. But it's been a wild 20 years, I can tell you that.
So the additions in the portfolio. So, I mean, prior to Pinot, the most recent one before that was Sauvignon Blanc?
Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah. And
that was
Blanc is huge these days. I mean, and I love your Sauvignon Blanc. I think Sauvignon Blanc is fantastic.
Yeah. So, I mean, we made tiny amounts of it at various places I've worked. Obviously, when I was in New Zealand, I made more millions of cases of Sauvignon Blanc as a harvest winemaker than I care to admit. And all I've done is, like, people would come to Rombauer, and we had a pretty developed red wine portfolio. So, you know, we had our Merlot, our Cabernet, our Zinfandel, with reserve wines and single vineyard wines. We had Rombauer Chardonnay. When people would come to the winery, they'd say, "Oh, I don't drink red wine. I'd like to try your white wines." And they'd get a glass of Chardonnay, and that would be the end of their tasting. And so I was pretty convinced that there was the opportunity, at least in the tasting room, to open up and make it another variety. The challenge is Colonel Rombauer didn't want us to make too many different wines. He felt we would lose the focus on what we do, and he just wanted us to make the best wine possible in any variety. And so it took me about 5 years to convince him to make Sauvignon Blanc. I literally had to wear him down. At one point I was like, I'll use my own money to buy the grapes just to prove my point, if you just let me get 5 tons. And by end of 2013, I convinced his son, KR Rombauer, that it was a good idea. And so Kerner in early 2014 said, all right, you can do 10 tons and we can bottle a little bit for the tasting room, but kid, it's not going to matter because nobody's going to buy it anyway. And we made it. I was very specific about where we got that first 10 tons from and how we made it. And obviously I knew a lot about making Sauvignon Blanc. And we bottled it, and Kerner tried it, and he loved it. And he was taking it everywhere and showing all the local restaurants the new wine we'd made and promising they could all have it on their wine list. And we hadn't even released it yet. And it became a big problem, actually. It got to the point in the winery we were having to hide the pallets of it so Kerner wouldn't go grab some.
Of course.
And before he passed away in 2018, it was fun to see him come down to the tasting room and like grab bottles of wine to have a dinner that night. And more often than not, he would grab a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc over Chardonnay, which I thought was vindication. And now, obviously, it's gone incredibly well. We have a very specific style of fruit-driven Sauvignon Blanc that we make that's not overripe, and it's gone from being our new thing, which nobody will buy anyway, to our second largest production wine this year.
That's pretty fantastic. I mean, I remember talking with you and Bob, who's the president there, about y'all bought some land and are pulling out Cabernet Not
Yeah.
Napa, but pulling out cab to plant Sauvignon Blanc. And who would have imagined that a decade ago? I mean, it's just impossible.
Yeah, well, we there was a couple of vineyards we were buying fruit from in the bottom of Sonoma Valley, and we were buying. There was a vineyard that was split between Cabernet and Sauvignon Blanc, and it's got a very specific type of alluvial fan with very rocky soil, and so it is suited better to those Bordeaux varieties. But we don't make a Sonoma Cabernet, and the bottom of Sonoma Valley doesn't make a style of Cabernet I think is very appealing. And so we kept the Sauvignon Blanc blocks, and we pulled out the Cabernet blocks and put Sauvignon Blanc in. Actually, where the last blocks, we'll be prepping those next week and planting them in June or July with Sauvignon Blanc.
So a customer here, John and Linda Campisi, are asking about where you get Sauvignon Blanc from in Sonoma. Obviously, you get some Sonoma Valley that you just talked about, or this new property.
Yeah, so bottom of Sonoma Valley, going up the Sonoma Valley into Kenwood, and then a little bit in Russian River. And there's a couple of these alluvial fans that come off the sides of the hills in the Sonoma Valley. We get this quite rocky soil that's quite high in iron, and it's very well drained. It does very well. And there's a couple of blocks in Russian River. That's where it is. And so we still have a couple of blocks in the bottom of the Charles Valley in Napa. But you know, legally the last vintage, we always label it the percentages of Napa and Sonoma County. But if we wanted to, this last vintage, it could have been, or we could have labeled it Sonoma County because it was 76% Sonoma County fruit. So, but it'll be, you'll probably see Sonoma County appear on the label in the next few years. And it's literally been this, how do we find the highest quality fruit? And it's just taken us on this little path.
And so you own some of it, you buy some of it? Is that?
Yeah, so we own about 150 acres of Sauvignon Blanc, which is about half of our needs. And then the other half is purchased fruit. But it's the same vineyards every year. We generally, when we find the vineyard we like, we sign it for as long as the owner will let us make a contract. And so we just work with the same vineyards every year. And it's the same with Chardonnay or Zinfandel or any wine that we make. You know, everyone always wants to know, why is Rombauer wine so consistent? Well, we work with the same vineyards every year. It's pretty simple.
I love my drinkers. They're all writing here. They're writing Sauvignon Blanc questions. So we're supposed to talk about Pinot here. Someone's asking how the fruitiness in Sauvignon Blanc that you find here compares to things like in Marlborough.
So it's pretty different. So Marlborough is interesting. You know, the best vineyards in Marlborough are not in the Wairo Valley, which is where all the famous wineries are. They're actually in the Arwatry Valley, which is across the hillside, and ripens a fraction later. But the main thing about Marlborough is the two main valleys where Sauvignon Blanc does well, almost like Côte Rôtie, you have these big pebbly soils, and they're these giant alluvial fans, and they're all old glaciers basically. And so it's very well drained soil. In Arwatry Valley, you have a lot of these like terraced riverside vineyards where the rivers moved over time and got lower and lower, and so you have these very rocky, pebbly terraces, and they grow incredible Sauvignon Blanc. The challenge in New Zealand is it's very cool, and it's unusually cool. And if you looked at the growing degree days in Marlborough, it's kind of on the cusp of being able to ripen, especially reds. The difference between Marlborough and say the Pacific Northwest, let's say the Sonoma Coast, is Sonoma Coast, you have the Pacific fog. So the fog rolls in every day, it cools everything down, and eventually it rolls out and you get afternoon sun. In Marlborough, you don't have coastal fog. So when the sun comes up in the morning, and the bottom of the South Island, that can be before 5 a.m., it's out, there's no fog. And so Marlborough actually has the highest sunshine hours of any wine growing region in the world.
Oh, wow.
So hours of actual sunlight is insanely high. So you're able to actually ripen fruit. You don't get the total sugar loading and the really high Brixes due to dehydration, but you get this really long sunshine hours where you're photosynthesizing. Coupled with that, Sauvignon Blanc's quite vigorous, and so they tend to use like VSP, so a canopy that's like this, but it's quite dense and lots of leaf layers, and that promotes methoxypyrazine, which is those bell pepper, green capsicum flavors, and that's what you see a lot in New Zealand is because of climate. When you come over to Napa, obviously, and Sonoma, it's warmer. You have the Pacific fog. We can find these alluvial fans, but we generally get higher photosynthetic ability because it's warmer, and our canopies tend to be less or more spaced out. And the reason for that is we don't want to promote as much of that shading internally in the canopy and get as much of those green methoxypyrazine characters. So we tend to make a Sauvignon Blanc that inherently has riper fruit flavors. But if you can get it right, you can pick a peak varietal intensity. And the thing I struggle with in California is a lot of winemakers tend to pick ultra ripe because they can, rather than picking at peak varietal intensity. And I know you and me have had this conversation a lot with Pinot, but with Sauvignon Blanc, that window where you hit peak varietal intensity, so we have the most amount of varietal flavor, is lower than what you think. And if you go beyond that, you make a white wine that's uninteresting. It lacks varietal character. It tends to have no interesting character. It just tastes like generic white wine. And I really dislike it. So they're sort of like the two main differences. So finding that picking window is critical to what we do.
Cool. All right. So let's talk about Pinot, because we are supposed to do that at some point in time.
Yeah.
So, I kind of had the idea of, coming over there and saying, hey, what about Pinot? And I had no
It's your fault.
Yeah, it really is. Like me. And it obviously has worked out incredibly well, but it is kind of a big thing. Rombauer doesn't start a new grape type, a new variety easily.
No, I mean, we've had master's students do business MBA theses on why Rombauer should make a Pinot.
Mm-hmm.
And I've lost times over the years that I've been there where people said, oh, I tried your Pinot and I love it. I'm like, we don't make a Pinot. But they've had a wine they thought was Rombauer and it was a Pinot and they remember it. And it's like, no, Rombauer doesn't make a Pinot. And Colonel Rombauer didn't want to do it for a whole host of reasons. One, Pinot's hard to make, it's fickle, whatever excuse Colonel came up with, he just didn't want us to lose the focus. And it wasn't until so you all know Adam used to be with Saduri, he sold to Kendall Jackson. Rombauer's CFO is from Kendall Jackson. He started with us 5 years ago this April. And obviously you and Matt, Rombauer's CFO, stayed in touch. And it was you who reached out to Matt and said, hey, I've got this spare time. Have you guys ever thought about making a Pinot? And Matt tells the story really well. He goes, I went through all these reasons why we shouldn't. I got to the end of it and he started talking myself into why I should do it. And that's very unusual for Matt, our CFO. He's very good at saying no. He's not very good at saying yes, which is, I think, very typical of CFOs, especially the wine business dealing with winemakers. And so Matt went to the president of Rombauer, Bob, and said, I know a guy who makes Pinot. And you guys had lunch, correct?
We actually had drinks at the end of the day. We had a bottle of the Clarice Pinot Noir.
What vintage?
At Albert's, the first one, the 17.
And what was it, the blend or the single?
It was the Gary's.
It was the Gary's. Oh, yeah, you knew what you were doing, you cheeky bastard.
We did, and we had the meeting and talked about it and talked about the possibilities and how it might work. And I left the meeting driving from Albert's down in Rutherford up over to Santa Rosa, not sure. I told Murray, I don't know if it went well or not. I think it went okay. I wasn't sure. And then I get a phone call from a number I don't really recognize, and I pick it up, and it's Matt. And he's like, we're heading over the hill to Santa Rosa to go to Bottle Barn to buy some Pinots. What do you recommend that we buy? And I'm like, oh shit, this went well. If they're going to buy wines right off. So
fast forward maybe 5 days, I think it was, according to Bob. And Bob we have like an open door policy for management at Rombauer. Like, you never close your office door. And Bob's office is right as you walk in to administration at Rombauer. The president of the company has an office right as you walk in. And Bob calls me and says, hey, come down to my office for a minute. I got to have a chat. I'm like, okay, which is, I talk to Bob all the time. Bob, I can call at 3 a.m. in the morning and he answers his phone. He's an amazing president. We're very good friends. And Bob's like, hey, if you were going to make another wine for Rombauer, what would you make? I'm like, what do you mean another wine? Like a new varietal or like a new reserve wine? What are you talking about? There's no new varietal. I'm like, well, we've got Zinfandel, we've got Cabernet, we've got Merlot, we've got Chardonnay, we've got Sauvignon Blanc. The only commercial varietal that does really well on this side of the world, on the Pacific Northwest, that we don't make, it's kind of Pinot, but that's the whole Pinot boom that's happened. Like, we've kind of missed the boat. And he goes, well, what if we could make a Pinot? And I was like, oh, this is too cool. Like, I knew straight away what he was asking. Like, Bob gets this smile on his face where you're like, he's opening Pandora's box.
Sure.
And I'm like, wow. He goes, where would you do it from? I'm like, Bob, I don't know. Like, where could we do it from? He's like, if you could choose anywhere. I'm like, well, we need to taste some wines and look at some data and look at climate data and soils. And, you know, we really need to, if we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. We don't do things by halves. He's like, okay, calm down. He goes, what Pinots do you like? I'm like, all good Pinot. I'm like, what winemaker does not like good Pinot? Like, show me a winemaker in the world who's serious about what he does and doesn't like Pinot, and I will say he's not a winemaker. So he's like, okay, right, calm down. I'm like, he's like, do you know Adam Lee? I'm like, the Siduri guy? He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, I know of Adam Lee. I've never met the guy, but I know who he is. He kind of, if you know anything about wine in California, you know who Adam is. He goes, you need to meet Adam. I'm like, why do I need to meet Adam? Like, and I remember it was like a couple of days after that you came over and we met. And I knew by this stage we were doing it no matter what. And I was so excited. I remember running you down to all our open top fermenters, which hadn't really been utilized that much since we stopped doing custom crush at Rombauer. And I was like, we can do this, we can do this. And you and me just like brainstormed for like an hour. And I probably sound like a kid, like with verbal diarrhea, but
we got along.
Cool.
We got along so well at the time. I was amazed at how set up the winery was, because I've been to wineries that make other things primarily. I mean, mainly say Bordeaux places, and unless they do a real job of changing things over or buying new tanks or buy it. I mean, it can be done, but I don't find that it works very well a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember, like Rombauer, when they built the winery in 1982 in San Helena, it was all custom crush. So they had to be set up to do everything for everyone. So obviously we have tanks that are great for Cabernet. We had barrel ferment storage for Chardonnay. That we had open tops for custom crush. And I was using them for Zinfandel a lot of the time. We do some crazy winemaking trials in them. But when I first started at Rombauer, I mean, there was Rocchioli Pinot that used to come through Rombauer in those open tops. I mean, if you want, I can tell you exactly which ones. It was OT5, okay. OT13, which is the wood tanks, and yep. OT10 was always Rocchioli Pinot. And like that was when I first started Rombauer in 04, that was my section. So I dealt with all the Pinot, and they put me there because I'd made Pinot in New Zealand and Australia. And so he literally, I remember Greg saying, put the Aussie kid over there, he won't get up.
Yes. Well, so we had an epic tasting at my house of Pinots from different areas. I mean, just a huge number, but grouped into, I mean, it was truly a tasting before it devolved into a drinking, which like good tastings it does at some point in time. But where we went through and we tasted blind Pinots, you know, here's five, a flight of five, and it happened to be from one area, and a flight of five from another area, and we went place to place. And then ultimately, it was Santa Lucia is kind of came through all of this.
Well, it was funny. That was, you know, I didn't know that much about you making wines down there. Like I knew you'd made some wine from the region, but I wasn't sort of super familiar with Clarice because it's such a small production wine. And I didn't sort of know what you were doing post Siduri. I knew you were still helping Siduri, but wasn't well aware. And that tasting was totally double blind. I mean, you bought all the wines and so I bought one bottle. Yeah. I bought a 2017 Felton Block 5 Pinot Noir, and it wasn't very good, which was disappointing, from New Zealand. And but so it was double blind for me, and it was double blind for Bob and Heather and Matt. And I was pretty tired because it was start of harvest and we were well into Chardonnay. But there were these certain wines in the flights that had this richness and depth, but incredible balance, and they all tended to be San Lucia. And you probably don't know this part of the story, Adam, but we went away and what did we taste that night? It was like 70 different wines.
Yeah, 70 or 80. It was a lot. A large number.
We went away as a team, and you know, I have my winemaking team. I spoke about Luke, but there's another winemaker, Rombauer, Andrew, who's a massive wine geek.
Yeah,
massive Pinot Noir as well.
Andrew gets the wine when we all go out. Usually,
we give him the wine list.
Andrew gets the wine list when we go out.
Yeah. He's that kind of geek, right? Yep. So we set Andrew off like buy all the best Pinots in North America. Just go buy as many bottles as you can. And I said, but my one caveat was you need to get some Santa Lucias in there. Don't overlook Santa Lucia from the tasting you and I had with the rest of the team. And we tasted those over a couple of months. And same thing again, like because we were tasting them like double blind, there were certain wines. I mean, there were always like outliers. Like we'd find like that bottle of wine and it'd be from Oregon. Well, that's a really good bottle of wine and it'd be from the Sonoma Coast. But invariably, there'd be this group of 4 or 5 wines that would be from Santa Lucia that would always be really good. And honestly, a lot of it revolved around raw, Lucia,
Yeah.
Pisoni, Clarice, and a handful of others. And so we just started crunching the data. So I just started looking at growing degree days. I have an app within Google Earth called Soil Web where I can look at the USGS soil maps for a region. We started looking at rainfall, like average daily temperatures. It all sort of penciled out this particular region, which I knew almost nothing about. Santa Lucia was unusually suited for growing Pinot. So then we started looking at wine scores and we're like, holy shit, the wines from this region do well. Like, I knew Gary's Vineyard. I'd tried the wines many times before, but I didn't really know what Gary's Vineyard was. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's a Gary's Vineyard Pinot. Fantastic. I know that's good. But I didn't know what it really meant, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I'd never spent a lot of time on the region. And once we started looking at wine scores, and then we started looking at vintage scores, once you stacked up the data, after you'd sort of tasted the wines, you're like, well, this makes sense. The data, the climate, average temperature, growing degree days, soil, rainfall, wine scores, vintage scores, it all stacks up and you're like, holy crap, this makes sense. Like the data actually supports what you're tasting, which doesn't always happen in wine.
Yeah.
And it was mind-boggling. I'm like, why does the whole world know about this region? Like it's like a good vintage in Santa Lucia is what they dream of as a great vintage in Burgundy. And that's just a good vintage.
Yeah.
Like a great vintage in Santa Lucia happens, and sorry, that's my dogs, happens more than you realize. And it's kind of freaky. And that's what we came to you and said, well, Adam, we think we should look at Santa Lucia. And you're like, I distinctly remember you saying this, well, you need to meet the Garys.
Yeah. And in fact, we have we have Adam and Nick Francione here today, and it's Adam Francione's birthday. So when we end this, we should all serenade Adam a little bit, or at least wish him a happy birthday. But going down and meeting the Pisoni family, the Francione family, I mean, you really get a feeling for the effort and the quality of farming, the quality of the fruit, the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I've always said this to you, Adam. It's we didn't know each other super well. Like we knew we got along and we were having fun and making wine. We didn't know each other well, and you didn't know Rombauer very well. But the fact, like, my top growers, I'm very protective of them. Mm-hmm. And not that I don't want them to meet other winemakers, but I don't want them to have a bad experience if I introduce them to someone. And the fact that you were like, no, you need to come down there and meet them. You didn't know us that well. And you're like, no, you need to understand what they're doing down here, Ben, if this is what you think it is. And the fact that you were so open and willing to introduce us, and I hate to say it for lack of a better, vouch for Rombauer, because Rombauer is pretty quiet about what they do. Like outside of the people we work with, nobody really knows about Rombauer. Like people know and love our wines, but if you've never met someone from Rombauer, you don't understand really what the company is and how we go about things in terms of quality and being very precise. So the fact that even though you didn't know us that well, you took us down, you're like, here's the best guys that I know you need to meet. I mean, that was, I've told you this many times, it's incredibly open and kind of reflects you as a person, how I always say you're an ultimate connector. You find like-minded people and you put them in the same room and
good things can happen when that.
Exactly. And you're very, very good at that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I had this feeling, this gut feeling about what you were doing after spending time with you, spending time with Bob. I mean, a silly thing that I bring up to people every now and then, but I remember the first Pinot coming into the winery when we first brought Pinot, and it being dumped, in before going into the optical sorter and all of that. And who's driving the forklift? Bob, the president of the company, is driving the forklift.
He was very much, everyone get out of my way. I'm dumping the first bit of Pinot. Like, he wanted to do it. But Bob's great, because during harvest, when we're short staffed, this is a man who's incredibly busy, right? He'll come and drive forklift for me like for 8 hours if I ask him to.
Sure.
Just what he does.
No, it's stuff like that. So I had that feeling of what Rombauer was about and what they could bring to the area. And then obviously hooking up good people, the Franchionis and Pizzonis together. And we don't really need to vouch. I mean, everybody knows them, but we don't need to vouch for them. But when you said vouch for Rombauer, it's not so much that as much as it is when you grow really good Pinot for a long time. Oh, here's a Napa winery that feels like they have to have a Pinot in their portfolio. You're going to take it seriously. And you saw a lot of that post Sideways. Yeah.
Well, if you look at what Rombauer does, we generally don't follow fads, right? We don't follow trends. If we feel we can make a wine and truly make it world class, we will. And that's it. We're not attached to a particular region, even though Rombauer started in Napa. We have a winery in the Sierra foothills. Most of our vineyard holdings are actually outside of Napa because we're making the best regionally specific wines we can. So we're not tied to a specific region. And we kick the tires. We were like, well, if we tasted the wines and we felt consistently Oregon, Willamette Valley, which makes incredible Pinot, if we felt that was consistently better than Santa Lucia, I tell you now, Adam, we'd be on a plane every other day going up there.
Yeah, we would.
But we just felt that Santa Lucia, based on taste, it doesn't get any better. Everyone on this call, and there's a lot of people, I'm assuming knew that well before me.
I promised some people here we'd get kind of geeky. So let's talk a little bit about the process. And one of them ties into a question that got posted here, tied into Zen a little bit, about someone who's a big fan of your Zens and the bigger style of Zens, and how does Pinot marry with that? And one of the things I remember is y'all have an optical sorter, which oddly enough, I haven't used really as far as Pinot goes, but you had to adjust the optical sorter to deal with Pinot Noir rather than with Zinfandel.
Cabernet. Yeah, it's a different grade. So you program the optical sorter based on the variety, and both Pinot and Zin have a very thin skin, and it's low in color. Zin's a little bit harder, but when you have these really powerful lights to take a photo, so I don't know how much you all know about photography, but the faster the frame rate, the faster the shutter speed, so the less exposure you have. So you have to have very bright lights to take a very high frame rate. And our optical sorters are running about 1,000 frames per second. So if you think about it, a stills camera, like a Canon or a Nikon, does about 12 frames per second. A movie camera is 24 frames per second. And a high-speed optical sorter is 1,000 frames per second. So the moment you have to take a photo is lower, so you need more light. And when you beam in that much light to get this very fast frame, you actually see through the skin of the grape if it's thin. And so with Zinfandel, which has a very green pulp, it's very hard to use an optical sorter effectively. Same happens with Pinot. It's not as difficult because the pulp isn't as green, but it's very, very hard. And when we first started, we ran a Cabernet program because of the berry size, because we can sort based on size, shape, and color. And the lights were seen through the skin of the Pinot, even though they were small berries, and rejecting everything.
Yeah.
And so we had to reprogram the optical sorter. And it took a little bit of, not to bore everyone, but playing with the aperture to change the field of view slightly so I could open it up and get a longer exposure with less bright light to get the photo of every grape that I wanted.
I remember at the very first, it's like, look at all this good chip that's fallen out of here.
Yeah. So just give me 10 minutes. Give me 10 minutes.
Then one of the things that we've done a little bit over the first couple of years is begin to play and do some more experiments with whole cluster. And as the Clarice people here know, I'm a fan of whole cluster with Clarice. I go perhaps to the edge of things. I didn't do nearly as much in at the Siduri days, but we are doing some of that and playing with some of it at Rombauer as well.
Yeah, it's funny. You and me differed on that. That's the one thing we probably differed on and we'd have polite discussions around early on, because you love whole cluster and I don't want to say I was anti whole cluster, but there were two things I was worried about. When we looked at the wines from Santa Lucia and we ran phenolic analysis, I saw very, very high tannin levels for Pinot compared to other parts of the world. So I was very concerned about having a Pinot that was too extracted. And one thing we're really good at Rombauer is extracting phenolics. It's just how our wineries are set up. And when I was making Pinot from the Adelaide Hills, we would do a lot of whole cluster, but these were quite high altitude Pinot vineyards, and we'll pick in very late, and so the stems would be very ripe. When I was making Pinot in the Yarra Valley in New Zealand, we'd get very, very green stems, and so we weren't doing any whole cluster. And so without sort of knowing what the fruit looked like when it came in, I was very worried about green tannin and hard hollow wines. Even though I tried your wines, you think you know better, right? Whether based on the data.
Each facility is different too, though. The way that it processes and all of that and how it works in different places.
Exactly. And when you're punching down, it's very gentle, but it's less precise, I guess, is one way to look at it. And so I was on the fence about whole cluster, but one thing I love about whole cluster is it gives the wine this floral depth, and it's almost like a lavendery damson plum character, which I see in all the Clarice wines. And when I smell them, I like my heart melts. I fall in love with them because of this floral, like if you could describe purple as a color, whole cluster and Clarice gives me that feeling. Like it's just this beautiful purple, floral, violet, damson plum character. And so I love that about whole cluster, but I'm so funny about over extracting the tannin. So, we played around with it a little, and I feel like now I understand the phenolic profile of the tannins in the wines. What do we do to first year? Like 15%?
Yeah. And not across the board. I mean, it was just
not across the board, just a couple of tanks.
Yeah.
And it worked really well. And then this year we had a couple of lots with really ripe stems where we did 30%. Yeah. And I think depending on the year, and I always defer to you on this, I feel like now I'm pushing you, Adam. What about this lot? Can we do whole cluster? And you're like, yeah, no, the stems aren't ripe enough. And I'm like, okay. And I feel like we're going more in that direction more and more, just for that beautiful depth in the aroma that whole cluster gives a Pinot.
And so we're getting fruit now at Rombauer from a large range of the SLH too, as well.
Yeah.
Which is interesting too, to see the southern end kind of versus the northern end.
Yeah, it's funny, like that southern end is like, it's like the muscular part of the appellation, right? It gives you the concentration, it's higher in color. It's just this dark, brooding wine. It's very California-esque. You travel up from that very southern end up to Sierra Mar, as long as it's not the Clone 23, it's less big. Then you get to Sobrenos and Gary's, and it's like that perfect middle spot in the appellation where I'm drinking Sobrenos tonight because Sobrenos and Gary's are my two favorite vineyards. And then as you come across to Rosellas, it starts to get more floral and more aromatic and lifted and more elegant as you move into the north. And yeah, I mean, I wish I had 20 years experience within this region, because I feel like I'm just starting to understand what it is. Actually, Adam, I can't wait to go down there with you in the start of May, because it's up on the top of SLH. As you go up in altitude, up the vineyards, you have vineyards which have that same sandy soil, but they're these alluvial fans that have more rock content, and it's decayed granite. And decayed granite generally gives you more iron and quartz, and you get these more robust, thicker skins. And I'm really fascinated now by that high altitude side of Santa Lucia, up above 700 feet. And I can't wait to look at this one vineyard with you, because it honestly, it looks like Côte Rôtie, but it's granite pebbles in the vineyard instead of sandstone pebbles, and it's quite fascinating.
Well, and I'm also excited by this vintage. I mean, a year where we had a good amount of rain, where
Oh
things,
no, finally, right?
right, if things have kind of started out slowly, now they're kicked into gear, given we've warmed up a bit. But I've always found that the best years, the truly great years, are the ones that ripen later in the season, where you have a longer, slower ripening process kind of, and you get to the end and the days are shorter, your odds of having an extended heat spike are lessened somewhat, and
Yep.
you run that risk of rain at the end. So I mean, it's kind of walking on that thin line of, it can all go be amazing or it can all fall off.
All go wrong at the end.
Yeah. One of the
Yeah,
two.
I think that's interesting. You know, one thing we've spoken about, you and me, we haven't done yet, is to look at the sugar and color loading down there.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I'm very curious to see how many grams of sugar per berry rather than the bricks we get, and what, like, where is our color loading stopping, and what is the advantage? Because we know it's better, right, down there. We know this extended hang time works better, but why? And how can we hedge our bets long term? Like, okay, we know we could hang this bit longer, even though bricks is going up because we're losing water, but we're actually still loading sugar. And
Sure.
is that what's giving us that better wine, or is it just riper seeds?
Well,
And that's what I
think riper seeds is part of it. And I can promise you, if you're doing whole cluster, if you are, that long hang time is leading to riper stems as well.
Well, it's funny as well, because you think about how late you're getting down there, and even still the bricks, it's not like the Sierra foothills or Napa where, you know, extended hang time, you're starting to get up into that 30 plus bricks region because you're losing water so fast and you're shriveling. Down there, you're getting a little bit of shrivel, but you don't really go crazy. And so I think it's quite, especially in that northern end, I really think it's going to be, like, we let Rosellas hang a really long time this year.
Yep.
And it was, I mean, I was blown away by the wines in tank.
Yeah.
I kept them separate, by the way. We're supposed to blend them away, you and me, and I'm like, I'm going to keep them separate and we'll retaste.
Well, so I mean, we got a couple of people, and we'll go a little over the hour, but not by much. A couple of people are asking, you know, what's the production on the 21 SLH? And I mean, one of the things that I did respect tremendously was the decision that we made in 21 that not to do vineyard designates right off, to get to make sure that the Santa Lucia Highlands, the first impression that Rombauer Pinot is making, is the absolute best impression.
Yeah, so, you know, we generally, at Rombauer, we make single vineyard wines. We do that. We're very picky about the single vineyard wines we make. And generally, the vineyard has to consistently produce high quality for a very long time before we do a single. And the thing I hate about the propensity of single vineyard wines is, and this happens with every winemaker I've ever worked with, we're going to bottle this separate because it's different.
Yeah.
And my argument is, just because it's different doesn't make it good. And we have some very, very amazing vineyards that we're working with. But, well, I mean, we've spoken about this, like Sobranos, we don't feel like we quite have our handle on the character of that vineyard yet and how to optimize it. Whereas Gary's, clearly standalone, Gary's and Rosellas, but especially Gary's, like, that is a single vineyard wine, hands down. And we toyed with the idea of doing it last year, but I felt like we as a team had to manage to nail those blocks that we got in that first year to truly make an amazing wine to warrant bottling it separate. So we blended it. We made a San Lucia blend, and we'll always make a San Lucia blend that represents the region. That'll be our Premier Cru or whatever village wine where we blend across parcels. But going forward, I felt like last year, you know, we had it was year 3 working in the region, even though in 2020 we didn't make a wine. It was our 3rd year working together as a team, you and me, with your team and my team. And I really felt like Gary's and Rosellas, we really just started to like crack the moment of when is best to pick and how to optimize it in the winery.
And it's truly the case where I mean, the hope is working together, we can crack this faster and move the curve ahead faster, we should be able to do that.
I
But
think we will have one.
in 2022, yeah, I know.
2022, what you and me have been working with on the barrel selection side, if we don't make a single vineyard Pinot from that, then we'll probably both lose our jobs because it's really, really good.
It is. We just, we get Bob involved in a blind tasting, and he'll taste and see.
I'll tell you now, I've got the glass ordered. I've got the label approval done. It's all ready to go. It's just a case of you and me coming up with something that we're happy with and proud of.
Sure.
And we're going to do it. So.
And they were someone was asking about the production of 21 SLH, and can they find it out and around? I know the demand is very high for the club.
Yeah, so we did 4,000 cases for the first 2 years across all the different parcels that we're working with. And it's actually only available at the winery. It's a DTC only wine. So if you go to Rombauer's website, rombauer.com, you'll be able to find it there at $65 a bottle. And that's where it is. We're not, Rombauer is a medium-sized winery with very, very high demand for all of our wines. And if 4,000 cases, if we tried to sprinkle that out across the country to all of our distributors and retailers, it would actually create a lot of problems and fights and do us a disservice. So certain wines we only keep at the winery that are on the smaller production because we don't want to upset retailers and distributors. Will it go out for national distribution? Probably one day if we can find enough vineyards to keep improving quality. And that's what me and Adam have been working on really hard the last 12 months, is trying to secure more fruit from really good vineyards. But at this stage, it's only available at the winery or on the Rombauer website.
And so last question for you, and then we can let everybody go and wish Adam Francione a happy birthday. But
I'm going to sing it to him.
Yes, we should. What's exciting for you coming up? I mean, like with Pinot, different barrel trials, different vineyards, different sections. What are you looking at right now?
You want me to open Pandora's box here, all the stuff?
Go ahead, that's fine.
So, Adam will kick me here, but or Adam Francione will, but they've got a new vineyard that's coming to production next to Gary's, which is in the old cactus farm down there. That excites me a lot for the future, for the next 20 years, immensely. I remember when Mark Bassoni, we were talking about soils, and I'm fascinated by the soil at Gary's. And when he did soil pits out there that day, he was sending me photos of the soil pits, and we were having this long conversation about the rock structure below the top 12 inches of soil and the amount of alluvial pebbles that are in there. And I say pebbles, I mean like rocks this big, not little things. Gary's vineyard, I feel like Gary's vineyard is actually 3 vineyards. I know this sounds crazy. I think there's a top and a bottom to Gary's. They're very, very different. And there's this rock vein that runs through Gary's that pops up like there's a ridge line through it. Adam's going to slap me up the backside head for this, but I would love to map that vineyard with NDVI and look at the phenolic and sugar loading within that rock soil versus the deeper soil to figure out what that difference is and how we can make better wine from it. And that might mean selectively picking sections of the rows with only very small amounts of fruit for the future. And it might only end up being 2 barrels of wine, but if it's 2 barrels of magical wine, you're
gonna be beloved with that request.
yeah. Well, I'm willing to put my own money
I understand
on the table to do that.
I always love it with growers when you ask for extra things, and they're so fantastic in the SLH about this, but it's like, oh my God, am I going to bring this up? Am I really going to bring this up?
Well, it's just, I'm new to this region, right? And, I've only been working with looking at those vineyards for 3 years. But to me, every difference we have in a vineyard of how we farm it, how we map it, how we pick it usually comes down to soil depth or changes in soil structure. And that might be soil type or rock content or sand content. But there's definitely differences within Gary's, which is, this long vein that comes down, and it's all the same row orientation. It cracks me up that Sabrinus is so different, and it's like just adjacent, but it's on the same soil, but different row orientation. It changes completely. But I feel like there's these very interesting things that happens in Gary's, but I'm only 3 years in and I haven't quite understood it yet. But like that road in the middle and where you come down, and then it has that part where it dips, where you and me both get fruit from.
Yeah.
And obviously the franchisees keep a parcel either side of that. It fascinates the hell out of me. And obviously soil depth relates to water holding content, and that relates to water stress on the vine. And I don't want to say low vigor is better, because I definitely have vineyards where low vigor is not better. But balance within the vineyard in terms of water holding capacity is what truly dictates color, and that dictates quality. And I'm kind of have this morbid fascination with it. So,
well, I think one of the great things, kind of by accident, but we've got 21, 22, and now 23. They look to be very different vintages.
Oh yeah,
and that you can learn faster. We can all learn faster by having. I mean, if back to back were all the same years, you wouldn't learn as much. In the case like this, we're going to learn.
You can also learn faster by bringing in a consultant named Adam Lee and like picking his brain and just walking vineyards with him for hours at a time, right? So,
I enjoy that tremendously. That's one of the highlights that I have. So, thank you, Richie. We're looking forward to trying the wine. Everybody here is, and coming up to the winery. I think we're going to be doing a webinar together on Rombauer's channel at some point coming up in May.
Yeah.
So
then we know what we'll do then is we'll let the Rombauer customers know, but we'll finish the topics we didn't get to talk about today for the Clarice people.
That will be perfect. Let me see if Adam Francione is willing to come on real quick so we can tell him happy birthday. Adam, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
Ah, nice.
Hey, birthday boy, how are you?
Good. Even better listening to you smart, energetic winemakers talk. So yeah, it was great. And I think
you hear of all the extra work that Richie's going to be giving you? Now that you're older and more mature, you're more capable, and need to be.
I did make sure Adam's dad wasn't on here to hear any of that before I spilled the beans. So
yeah, I'm taping it though. So
that's great. That's one of the great things about Rich is he's
so
always
unmute us,
dedication
so we can sing.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you for all your work you do in the vineyard, you and your family, and happy birthday. Do you have plans tonight? I mean, you got 2 kids at home below just a couple of years of age, so.
Yeah, that, and I think you guys have made me pretty thirsty. So I think maybe a bottle of Clarice and Rombauer to forget that number is creeping up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here. Everybody, you can unmute and say goodbye. Thank you all for being part of it.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, we got to sing happy birthday.
Yeah, we should. So everybody, you want to join in? Okay, I'll
unmute.
Unmute yourself. I'll start it out. You ready?
Yep.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Get out.
Happy birthday.
Adam.
Happy birthday to you.
Wow.
There you go, Adam. All over the place.
Thank you. That's awesome. Appreciate it, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Cheers. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Cheers, guys.